Hello, Dr. Jay Wortman. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
Okay, we're talking about low-carb diets, and we're talking about how the low-carb diet model, it just doesn't fit with the mainstream of medicine. And one of the things that I've noticed is that if a patient ignores mainstream medical advice on something like cancer treatment or infectious disease, it's worse for their health. What happens if you ignore mainstream medical advice on diet nutrition and switch to a low-carb, high-fat diet?
Well, a lot of people get better, and I think that it really hinges on people's tolerance of carbohydrates. That concept is now starting to be discussed, that people have intolerance to carbohydrates. Some people have a higher threshold than others.
So what does that mean? If you have an intolerance for carbohydrates, does that change your metabolism,
Yes.
your hormonal response?
What I think it really hinges on is whether you're developing insulin resistance or not. If you're not developing insulin resistance, you can eat a carbohydrate-rich diet and apparently not get into certainly any immediate trouble. But people that are developing insulin resistance, and it can be very early and otherwise silent, will start to react to carbohydrates and develop problems ranging from acid reflux to mood disorder to things like fatty liver, lipid disorders, hypertension, whole range of things.
And that's what's happening when you're following the mainstream low-fat diet advice.
Well, the mainstream advice is to get a majority of your calories from carbohydrates. So it's a diet that's high in starch and very permissive in the amount of sugar you can eat.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so what do you recommend?
I recommend a low-carb diet.
What kinds of percentages? What kind of?
Well, I've become more radical as time goes by because I actually don't think humans were meant to eat grain.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a recent development in the history of human nutrition.
So wheat, corn, oats.
They're all
barley,
grains.
None of that.
So we end up with a very high carb, starchy diet from our consumption of grains. And then there's the additional issues around the proteins, the gluten and the gliadin and so on, that William Davis has talked about in his book, Wheat Belly. So I don't think we were meant to eat that diet of starch from grains. I also don't think we were meant to eat the sugar that we tend to eat. So when you eliminate those foods from your diet, most people find that they get much better. A lot of these conditions get much better very quickly.
Now, there was a recent study from the CDC reporting on the long-term effects of sugar in the population. Are you familiar with that study, and what did you think of it?
Well, there's a lot of work now coming to the sort of emerging that are telling us that sugar wasn't such a healthy thing to eat after all. And I think that's a good thing. I think that the sugar industry has been very effective up until recently in keeping that kind of information out of the public domain. And I'm giving a talk next 2 weeks from now in Philadelphia about this, about how early on, for instance, the man that founded the Harvard School of Nutrition School of Public Health Department of Nutrition, Dr. Frederick Stare, was actually working for the sugar industry and worked to skew the perception of sugar as a non-problematic food, and he was quite successful in doing that. And he was actually the founder of the School of Public Health Department of Nutrition, worked for the sugar industry and was part of their campaign to minimize the harm of the emerging science. People like Yudkin was publishing a book. He published the book Pure, White, and Deadly, basically reviewing the evidence of the day on sugar, and they were very good. They were very effective at neutralizing that threat to their industry.
Do you think that might have tipped the balance between, there was the fat and sugar dichotomy?
Well, I think it coincided, and it may have been just a nice coincidence, but it certainly benefited the sugar industry because it took away the focus on sugar as a potential harm, placing the focus, as it turned out erroneously, on dietary fat. Yeah.
So if you eliminate the grains, you eliminate the sugar, you add fat to your diet and keep protein moderate, what does that do to your risk factors for chronic disease?
As far as I can tell, everything gets better. The fat is important, though. I steer my patients away from the high omega-6 vegetable oils. When you think about it, that's another recent addition to the human diet in terms of the history of our nutrition.
That would be canola oil and what other?
Basically all the seed oils and soy oil. Canola is probably the least problematic of the bunch because the omega-6 in canola has some counterbalancing with omega-3, but none of those oils are terribly good for us because they're all vulnerable to oxidization, and oxidized fatty acids are not healthy, and certainly they're not good for cooking, which promotes oxidization. So what I generally tell people is use olive oil for cold applications, use butter, lard, or coconut oil for cooking, and if you're buying products off the shelf, say mayonnaise or something like that, if the choice is between soya oil, corn oil, or canola, canola is the least problematic of that group.
So one last question, just looking ahead to the future for the low-carb movement, if you would. What do you think is going to be happening next? What does your crystal ball tell you?
That's an interesting question, and this is actually the subject of the talk I'm giving in Philadelphia in a couple of weeks, a retrospective look at how the last big surge in low-carb eating, which happened about 12 years ago, got reversed. And there was a lot of concerted effort by different sectors of the food industry and agricultural producers who were threatened by that, who saw their business share dropping, and who fought back, and as it turned out, I think quite effectively in reversing the public perception that this was a good idea, that low-carb was a good idea. So I think we need to be vigilant for that sort of thing going on again. I do think that the upsurge now that we're seeing is backed by more science. There are more studies that can be cited now.
And the paleo movement, I think, is having a bigger influence now.
Connects, it overlaps with paleo, and paleo's taken off. People are grasping the idea of paleo and getting into low carb to a certain extent that way. So I think it may be, we're always hopeful that maybe we'll hit a tipping point and it will go over and not get reversed again. I look at Northern Europe. Sweden has done very well. I think the last time they looked, about a quarter of the population there was low carbing, and they've had some high level government endorsements and so on. So and the other thing is that the burden of chronic disease, particularly diabetes and other obesity related conditions, I don't think society can afford to fund that.
What do you think it would take for, say, the American Diabetic Association to switch to recommending limited carbs for diabetic patients, or for basically to get the mainstream to change its direction? That's a difficult question to answer, because you have to realize that there are incredible incentives for them to maintain the status quo. The funding they get from the sectors that benefit from chronic disease, the drug industry and the food industries that put these products out there, those organizations would have a hard time surviving in any form that resembles what they do now without that funding. And if they turn around and bite those hands that are feeding them, that's a difficult thing to do. And then you have the human nature effect of people have had their whole career based on the conventional thinking. So to do a 180 and say we were wrong, that's a big thing to do. Just one last thing. One thing that's happened in science before is that it's more of a changing of the guard. People who've been established don't actually. I think
Conrad Lorenz said new ideas don't take hold because of their merits. It's because the believers of the old ideas die off.
Exactly.
I think that's. Exactly. I hate to be that cynical, but I think it's a very uphill struggle to get people to change their minds. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with CarbSmart, this is Ed Stockly with Dr. Jay Wortman. Thank you very much, sir.
My pleasure.